Welcome to an exploration of one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. Today, we will immerse ourselves in a mystery that has persisted unsolved for more than 100 years, hidden within the shadowy mountains of North Carolina. Before we start, please share in the comments where you are watching from. I am curious to know who is joining us for this investigation. The year was 1912. The globe had not yet witnessed the horrors of the Great War. However, in the secluded areas of the Appalachian Mountains, different forms of terror already dwelled within the minds of small communities. North Carolina at that time was a state of stark contradictions. While urban centers such as Charlotte and Raleigh were sensing the initial waves of modernity, with electric streetcars and growing textile mills, the western mountains remained largely isolated from advancement. There, among fog-shrouded peaks and deep valleys, where sunlight scarcely reached, lived families upholding traditions centuries old, many being descendants of the original Scottish and Irish settlers who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean long before. The Appalachian Mountains in that area created a natural maze of narrow paths, uncharted caves, and woodland so thick that even seasoned hunters were reluctant to go alone. The local wildlife included black bears, bobcats, and poisonous snakes. Yet the true peril, as many residents murmured by campfires, was not always from nature. Old tales existed of individuals who entered those woods and simply vanished, as if the mountains had opened up and consumed them. Margaret Hale was 23 years old when her name became forever linked to one of the most deeply troubling puzzles ever documented in that region. She was not a dramatic or contentious person. Quite the opposite. Everyone who knew her described her as a common young woman with a soft temperament and a timid smile. The daughter of a small-scale farmer in Haywood County, Margaret grew up assisting her mother with domestic chores and looking after her younger brothers and sisters. Her father, a strict but just man, cultivated tobacco and corn on land that had been in the family for 3 generations. Life was hard but predictable, until suddenly it was not. In early March of that year, Margaret was supposed to undertake a simple errand. Her maternal aunt, who lived on a property roughly 15 kilometers away, had become gravely ill. The woman had no children of her own, and Margaret, always dedicated to her family, volunteered to spend several days nursing her. The journey involved crossing 2 small mountains and following a path locally known as the Cedar Way, named for the ancient trees bordering the route. It was a path Margaret had traveled previously, but always with company, never alone. On the morning of March 15th, a gloomy day with low clouds promising rain, Margaret bid farewell to her parents. She carried a bundle of clothing, some food wrapped in cloth, and a small bottle of medicine her mother had prepared from healing herbs. She was dressed in a dark blue dress, a wool shawl, and well-worn leather boots. Her father was reluctant to let her go unaccompanied, but the situation provided no other option. Her brothers were occupied with the spring planting, and he himself could not leave his tasks. Margaret reassured everyone, stating she knew the way perfectly and would reach her destination before dark. She never arrived at her aunt's home, and even more alarming, she was never seen alive again. When dusk settled over the mountains that Friday and Margaret did not appear, her aunt grew anxious. She sent a neighbor to check if something had occurred. The man returned, retracing the same path Margaret should have taken, but found no trace of the young woman. By the time they reached the Hale farm, it was already night, and the news that Margaret had not arrived transformed their concern into outright dread. Her father immediately formed a search party. About 20 men from the community, equipped with flashlights, torches, and rifles, set out in the early hours of Saturday morning. They scoured the cedar trail meticulously, calling out Margaret's name until they were hoarse. The trail revealed no indications of a struggle or attack. There was no blood, no torn fabric, or any dragging marks. It was as though Margaret had simply dissipated into the thin mountain air. For 3 days, the search continued without respite, Experienced men familiar with every rock and tree in the land probed areas farther and farther from the original route. They examined caves, gorges, and even old, disused wells. They questioned every inhabitant of the nearby farms, but nobody had witnessed Margaret pass by. It was as if she had been wiped from existence the very instant she left her parents' house. The whole community was stunned. Women prayed in their churches. Men coordinated increasingly frantic search parties. The county sheriff was informed and arrived with 2 deputies. But even with official support, no solid leads materialized. The mountains kept their secret with an impenetrable silence. Then, on the morning of March 19th, everything shifted. A young hunter named Thomas Brennan, knowledgeable of little-used back paths, chose to investigate a more remote section. Following a dark intuition, he climbed a steep track leading to a rocky ledge known locally as Raven Rock, a spot most people avoided due to old superstitions. There, in a small clearing surrounded by twisted oak trees, Thomas found something that would freeze his blood. Try again. I continue at it part 2. What Thomas Brennan uncovered on that cold March morning surpassed any rational understanding the Appalachian mountain people could provide. Raven Rock was an isolated rocky outcrop situated nearly 2 miles from the Cedar Trail. Reaching it required a complete departure from Margaret's planned route, scaling steep slopes covered in thick undergrowth and fording an icy creek running between slippery stones. There was no sensible reason for anyone to make that trek, particularly a young woman carrying a bundle by herself and rushing to get to her destination before nightfall. Thomas approached the clearing with caution. The silence there was unusual, heavier, as if even the birds and insects shunned that place. In the center of the open area, surrounded by a nearly perfect ring of stones that appeared to have been deliberately arranged, lay Margaret Hale's body. She was positioned on her back, her arms stretched out at her sides in an unnervingly symmetrical, almost ritualistic posture. Her open eyes stared at the gray sky, and an expression Thomas could never fully articulate was fixed on her face. It was not precisely fear or pain. It was something more profound, more disquieting, a sort of transcendent horror, as if she had glimpsed something the human mind was not designed to comprehend. The dark blue dress Margaret had on when she left home was untouched, without tears or mud stains, despite the implausible distance from the main path. Her boots were clean, lacking the expected scuff marks from a difficult hike over rough ground. The bundle of clothes and the medicine vial were placed next to her, neatly positioned, as if someone had wanted to maintain order and decorum. But the most alarming detail, the one that would haunt investigators for weeks, was in Margaret's hands. She clutched a small hemlock branch, a poisonous plant recognized locally, but not known to grow naturally at that elevation. Her hands were firmly closed around the branch, her pale fingers interlaced, as if she had gripped it in her last moments of life. And there was more. Around Margaret's neck, someone had put a crude necklace fashioned from woven twigs and tiny bird bones. This was not something she had worn when she left home. Her parents would later confirm this, horrified. This unsettling object had been placed on her by another person. Thomas dashed down the mountain to fetch help, tripping over his own feet. His breath labored not just from the physical strain, but from the terror of what he had seen. When the sheriff and a group of men reached Crow Rock a few hours later, the scene remained exactly as Thomas had reported. The county doctor, a white-haired man named Dr. Jonathan Pritchard, was summoned to inspect the body. He worked in silence, kneeling beside Margaret, while the other men maintained a respectful distance, many unable to look directly at the scene. Dr. Pritchard found no visible signs of physical trauma. There were no injuries, contusions, or marks of strangulation. Margaret's clothing was undisturbed with no suggestion of an assault. The doctor meticulously examined every visible part of her body, jotting notes in a small notebook with slightly unsteady hands. He estimated the time of death to be 3 to 4 days prior, meaning Margaret probably died on the same Friday she vanished, or at the latest, the following Saturday. The cause of death, however, remained an absolute enigma. There was no rationale for why a healthy 23-year-old woman had simply stopped living. The hemlock branch in Margaret's hands prompted the first troubling theory. Had she consumed some part of the toxic plant? But why? Margaret displayed no symptoms of depression or hopelessness. Her family insisted she was in good spirits, even eager about the chance to help her ill aunt. And even if she had chosen to end her own life, why would she have walked for miles across impossible landscape to a secluded spot she probably did not even know? And who had positioned that grim necklace around her neck? The sheriff commanded the body be taken back to town. 6 men descended the mountain, carrying Margaret on an improvised stretcher, a silent and mournful procession that would be remembered for decades. News of the discovery rapidly circulated through adjacent communities. What had started as a frantic hunt for a missing young woman had morphed into something much more sinister, a conundrum that resisted all logic and sense. Over the subsequent days, the sheriff carried out extensive interviews. He questioned Thomas Brennan multiple times, initially suspecting the young hunter might be involved. After all, how had he known exactly where to search? Why had he decided to climb to Raven Rock, a location not even included in the official search zone? Thomas swore, under all possible oaths, that he had followed only a gut feeling, an unexplainable sensation that had guided him there. Several locals verified that Thomas was a respectable, diligent, and truthful young man. There was no basis to suspect him beyond the disturbing coincidence of his being the discoverer. The sheriff then focused on Margaret's family. Was there some hidden secret, some dispute that could clarify what had transpired? The parents were asked about their daughter's private life. Did Margaret have any admirers? Had she endured any recent emotional pain? Was she exchanging letters with anyone outside the area? Each inquiry received the same response. Margaret was a quiet young woman, committed to her family with no known romantic attachments. Her existence was straightforward and routine, centered on domestic duties and family responsibilities. The Aunt Margaret was going to visit was interviewed in her sickbed. The woman, already weak from her sickness, was even more weakened upon hearing of her niece's fate. Crying, she confirmed she had sent a message requesting assistance, but she never dreamed it would lead to disaster. She knew of no one who would want to harm Margaret. The young woman was cherished by all who knew her. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread through the mountains rapidly. Ancient superstitions, those handed down through generations since the era of the first settlers, re-emerged with new intensity. People whispered about the legends of Raven Rock, a place always regarded as cursed by the elders. They claimed that decades, maybe centuries earlier, something awful had happened there. Some talked of dark ceremonies performed by recluses living in isolation in the mountains. Others spoke of vengeful spirits inhabiting the highest peaks, beings that enticed unaware travelers into fatal snares. The pastor of the local Baptist church, a pragmatic man named Reverend Samuel Kirby, attempted to soothe the situation during Margaret's funeral. He spoke about the mysteries of God's plan and the necessity to trust in heavenly justice when earthly justice falls short. But even his steady voice held a tone of doubt. Everyone felt something was profoundly wrong about the death, something that went beyond ordinary explanations of accident or common crime. Margaret was interred in the small church cemetery on a rainy March afternoon. Dozens of mourners attended, many from faraway communities. Margaret's mother collapsed onto the coffin, her cries resonating among the ancient gravestones. Her father stood rigid like a stone statue, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the mountains, as if seeking answers in the very rock formations that had swallowed his daughter. Try again. R. Continue. Edit Part 3. The weeks following Margaret Hale's burial yielded more questions than answers. The Haywood County Sheriff, a man named William Tesla, with more than 20 years of law enforcement experience in these mountains, had never encountered such a baffling case. He was recognized for his systematic and logical method, unswayed by superstition or imaginative tales. But even Tesla was starting to feel there was something unexplainable about the death, something beyond standard investigative techniques. Resolved to find a reasonable explanation, the sheriff arranged another trip to Crow Rock. This time, he brought not only deputies, but also a state surveyor who was working in the region, mapping the mountains. The aim was to precisely document where Margaret had been discovered and look for any evidence that might have been missed during the initial discovery. The expedition departed on a clear April morning, just as spring was finally starting to warm the Appalachian foothills. What they found at Raven Rock only intensified the mystery. The circle of stones around where Margaret had been located was still in place. Sheriff Tesla ordered each stone to be examined, turned over, and inspected. They were ordinary local stones, granite and quartz, without any carvings or distinctive marks, but the formation of the circle was disturbingly exact, almost geometric in its perfection. Someone had invested significant time in arranging those stones in that specific pattern. But when and for what purpose? The surveyor, a courteous man named Henry Caldwell, took precise measurements and thorough notes. He confirmed that the site was 2.5 miles from the Cedar Trail, the path Margaret should have followed. The most direct route between the 2 points would involve navigating extremely tough terrain, including a steep ascent, with an incline of nearly 45 degrees in sections. Caldwell, accustomed to walking in the mountains for his profession, admitted he would find the journey demanding, even with proper gear and daylight. For a young woman in a long skirt and worn boots, carrying a bundle of possessions, it would be virtually impossible. Tesla then posed a critical question. Was there another, simpler way to reach Raven Rock? The surveyor consulted his maps and pondered the topography. There was an alternative path, he clarified, which meandered around the mountain's base and eventually climbed a more gradual incline to the plateau. This way would be longer, adding maybe 3 miles to the trip, but undoubtedly more practical for someone without climbing skills. The team opted to investigate this route. As they made their way down the alternate trail, they came across a troubling discovery. In a narrow section squeezed between 2 rock formations, they spotted a piece of dark blue fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. The material was identical to that of Margaret's dress. The sheriff carefully collected the evidence, noting the precise location in his notebook. This confirmed Margaret had come this way, but it prompted an even more alarming question. If she had been following this alternate trail, it indicated she had intentionally left her intended path. Why? Had she become lost? Yet there were no accounts of fog or bad weather that day. And if she wasn't lost, then was someone leading her or coercing her? They continued their descent, and roughly a kilometer from the mountain's base, they found another clue. A small footprint in the dry mud beside a stream. The shape indicated a woman's boot matching Margaret's size. Next to this footprint were larger impressions, unquestionably from a man. Tesla's heart pounded. Finally, tangible proof that Margaret was not alone, but the marks were old, worn by rain and time. It was not possible to tell if they were from the same day Margaret vanished or from weeks before. The expedition returned to town at dusk, and Tesla convened a meeting with the men who had taken part in the original search. He presented his findings and asked a direct question. Had anyone checked this alternate trail during the 3-day search? The answer was disheartening. No one had considered it because it led in the opposite direction from Margaret's aunt's house. The searchers had concentrated their efforts on the direct route and nearby areas, logically presuming any detours would be accidental and brief. No one had imagined that Margaret could have willingly walked or been taken miles in the wrong direction. Tesla then broadened his investigation. He started questioning residents living on properties along the alternate trail. Most were isolated families, living in simple cabins, surrounded by small farms. These people saw very few outsiders throughout the year, and any visitor would be noticed and remembered. One by one, Tesla questioned them, asking if they had seen Margaret or anyone suspicious in the days around March 15th. Most had nothing to report. But then, in a particularly remote cabin about a mile from Raven Rock, Tesla met an elderly widow named Eliza Drummond. The woman had lived alone since her husband died of pneumonia 3 winters earlier. She kept a few chickens and a small vegetable patch, rarely going down to town except to buy essential supplies once a month. When Tesla brought up Margaret Hale's death, something shifted in Eliza's face. Her eyes narrowed, and she paused before speaking. She had seen something, she finally confessed. On the afternoon of March 15th, just before dusk, Eliza was fetching water from a well behind her cabin when she heard voices. This was unusual, as the trail near her property was seldom used. She crept discreetly to the window and looked through the worn curtains. 2 figures were moving along the trail. One was clearly a young woman, wearing a dark dress and carrying a bundle. The other was a tall man dressed in dark clothes and wearing a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. They walked close together, but Eliza couldn't hear what they were saying. The sheriff felt a surge of excitement. Finally, a witness. He pressed Eliza for more details. Did the young woman seem distressed? Did she seem coerced? Eliza frowned, trying to recall her memories of that afternoon. Not exactly, she said. The young woman didn't appear to be struggling or resisting. In fact, she walked strangely, almost as if in a trance, her movements slow and mechanical. And there was something else, something Eliza only realized later when the 2 figures had disappeared around a bend in the trail. The man wasn't walking normally. His strides were too long, his posture too rigid. There was something profoundly wrong with the way he moved, but Eliza couldn't quite identify it. Tesla asked if she recognized the man. Could he be someone from the area? Eliza shook her head. She had never seen this individual before, and she knew practically every adult man within a 10-mile radius. This was a stranger. She was sure. The sheriff then asked the most important question. Why hadn't Eliza mentioned this before? Why hadn't she contacted the authorities when she learned a young woman was missing? Eliza's response was disturbing. She was afraid. That night, after seeing the 2 figures, she locked all the doors and windows of her cabin and didn't leave until noon. There was something about the 2 people that filled her with an inexplicable dread, especially the man. Even now, weeks later, she felt a chill down her spine, remembering the way he moved, as if his limbs didn't completely obey the natural laws of human movement. Eliza was a woman who had lived alone in the mountains for years, who had faced bears and storms without flinching. But that man, that presence, had awakened in her a primal fear she couldn't name. Tesla left Eliza's cabin with more questions than answers. Who was the mysterious man? How had he persuaded Margaret to leave her path and follow him for miles through the mountains? And what was so disturbing about his appearance and movements that had frightened a mountain woman accustomed to all manner of hardship? The sheriff knew he needed to find this man, but he had no facial description, no name, virtually nothing but the testimony of an elderly widow who spoke of forebodings and irrational fears. Try again. Our continue edit part 4. Eliza Drummond's description, vague as it was, gave Sheriff Tesla a new direction for his investigation. He returned to town and began systematically questioning every merchant, innkeeper, and tavern owner in Haywood County. Were there any strangers in the area during those March days? Had anyone seen a tall, dark-dressed man, possibly traveling alone? North Carolina at that time had its share of travelers, peddlers, itinerant preachers, and seasonal workers. But most of these visitors followed the main roads, not venturing into the secluded mountain trails. The answers were frustrating. Some merchants remembered strangers, but the descriptions were vague and contradictory. The hardware salesman mentioned a tall man who had bought supplies in early March, but couldn't recall specific details. The owner of the town's only inn recalled several guests during that period, but none who exactly matched the description. It was as if the mysterious man had appeared and disappeared without a trace, a fleeting shadow in the mountains. Tesla then turned his attention to the county archives. He spent days poring over dusty documents, searching for similar cases that might offer some clue. What he found was simultaneously fascinating and frightening. Over the past 3 decades, there had been at least 6 reports of unexplained disappearances in the mountains surrounding Raven Rock. Most involved lone travelers, people who were crossing the region and simply never reached their destination. 3 of these cases were never solved, and the bodies were never found. The other 3 ended with the discovery of remains under bizarre circumstances. One case in particular caught Tesla's attention. In the year 1896, 16 years before Margaret's death, a young itinerant preacher named Ezekiel Moody disappeared while traveling between 2 small mountain communities. His body was found 2 weeks later in a ravine less than 2 miles from Raven Rock. The circumstances were eerily similar. There were no signs of violence. His clothes were intact, and he was holding a strange object in his hands. In this case, a small crucifix made of intertwined twigs that was definitely not his. The doctor who examined the body at the time was unable to determine the cause of death. Tesla dug deeper into the files and discovered something even more disturbing. The sheriff who investigated the Ezekiel Moody case in 1896 was a man named Abraham Colra. In official records, Colra maintained a professional and matter-of-fact tone. But Tesla also found Colt Train's personal notes scribbled in the margins of documents, observations that were never included in the formal reports. In one of these notes, Colt Train mentioned interviewing a hermit living in the mountains, someone who claimed to have seen Preacher Moody in the company of a tall man dressed in dark clothing walking toward the highest peaks. The hermit had described the stranger as having a peculiar, almost unnatural gait. Tesla's heart raced as he read those words. It was practically the same description Eliza Drummond had given. Could the same man be involved in both cases 16 years apart? But that would mean the suspect was at least 40 or 50 years old now, possibly older. Tesla searched for more information about the hermit Cold Train mentioned, but the name appeared nowhere else. It seemed that this witness, like so many other aspects of these cases, had disappeared into the shadows of the mountains. Determined to find answers, Tesla decided to do something unusual. He called a public meeting at the Baptist church, inviting all the oldest residents in the area. If there was a pattern to these disappearances, if there were legends or stories that could shed light on the mystery, the elders would be the guardians of that knowledge. On the chosen night, about 40 people attended, filling the wooden pews of the small church. Candlelight flickered on the walls, creating dancing shadows that seemed to heighten the atmosphere of unease. Tesla explained the purpose of the meeting. He described the Margaret Hale case, mentioned previous cases he had uncovered in the archives, and asked for anyone to share any information, no matter how strange or unlikely. There was an uncomfortable silence. People exchanged glances, clearly hesitant to speak. Finally, an elderly man in the last row slowly stood up, leaning on a cane. His name was Josiah Blackwell, and he was 82 years old. He had been born and raised in these mountains, just like his father and grandfather before him. Josiah began speaking in a hoarse but firm voice. The stories he was about to tell, he said, were considered superstition by most people, tall tales meant to scare children. But there was truth in them, he believed. Ancient, dark truth. According to Josiah, Crow Rock was known to the Native Americans who inhabited the region long before the arrival of European settlers. They called it a place Josiah couldn't pronounce correctly, but it meant something like place where spirits pass through. It was considered a place of power, but also of great danger. The Native Americans avoided camping near it and never under any circumstances visited the site after sunset. When the first settlers arrived in the 1700s, they ignored the warnings. Some even tried to establish farms near Crow Rock, but strange things began to happen. Livestock disappeared. Children reported seeing a tall man watching them from the trees at dusk. Some people who ventured too close to the rocky plateau returned, changed, speaking in a confused voice, their eyes glazed over as if they had witnessed something their minds could not process. Eventually, the farms were abandoned. People learned to avoid the area. But there was more. Josiah continued. Throughout the generations, there had always been tales of a being that inhabited the highest parts of the mountains. Not quite a man, though he took human form. Not quite a spirit, though he didn't appear entirely material. The elders called him by different names. The Walker, the Nameless One, the Shadow Guide. They said he appeared to lonely people, especially those experiencing moments of vulnerability or confusion. He had the power to influence minds, to make his victims willingly follow him to the most remote and isolated places in the mountains. There, something happened. Something that resulted in death, but no ordinary death. It was as if the victims were drained of their lifeblood, leaving only empty shells. The silence in the church was absolute. Some people shook their heads, clearly skeptical of Josiah's account. Others, however, especially the older ones, nodded in agreement. They had heard the same stories from their parents and grandparents. Reverend Kirby, presiding over the meeting alongside Sheriff Tesla, cleared his throat uncomfortably. He tried to soften Josiah's account, suggesting that they were merely folk tales born of the natural fear people felt when faced with the immensity and isolation of the mountains. But Josiah wasn't finished. He mentioned something that made even the skeptics sit up and take notice. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, a group of Confederate soldiers was moving through the mountains trying to avoid Union patrols. 7 men entered those woods. Only 3 emerged, and they were in a state of profound shock. They were found wandering in circles near a small village, mumbling incoherently. It took days for them to regain the ability to speak comprehensibly. When they finally managed to tell what had happened, their story was terrifying. They had camped near Raven Rock, unaware of the place's reputation. During the night, one of their companions simply got up and began walking toward the forest, as if sleepwalking. When they tried to restrain him, he struggled with surprising strength and finally escaped. The other 3 men who disappeared did the same over the following nights, one by one, rising from their sleeping bags and walking into the darkness of the forest as if they were puppets, controlled by invisible strings. The 3 survivors fled at dawn on the 4th day, too terrified to try to rescue their companions. Try again. R. Continue. Edit. Part 5. Josiah Blackwell's account left the congregation in a state of palpable unease. Sheriff Tesla, a man of law and reason, found himself at a crossroads. He couldn't simply dismiss the stories as superstition, not when there were so many similarities to the Margaret Hale case and the other disappearances documented in the county records. At the same time, he couldn't include in an official report that he was investigating the possibility of a supernatural entity being involved in the deaths. This would make him a laughingstock and possibly cost him his job. After the meeting, Tesla spent sleepless nights turning the facts over in his mind. He was a pragmatic man, but he was also honest with himself. There were elements in Margaret's case that defied conventional explanations. the impossible distance she traveled, the lack of signs of struggle or violence, the expression on her face when she was found, that transcendent terror Thomas Brennan described, the macabre necklace of twigs and bird bones, the hemlock branch clutched in her hands, and now Eliza Drummond's testimony about the tall man with unnatural movements, echoing descriptions going back decades, perhaps centuries. Tesla decided to make one last attempt to find concrete evidence. He organized a new expedition to Raven Rock, this time with a specific objective. He wanted to excavate around the stone circle, searching for buried remains that might reveal whether the site had previously been used for sinister purposes. He took 4 trusted men with him, including a burly farmer named Marcus Henley, known for his physical strength and unwavering courage. They reached the rocky plateau on a cloudy May morning. Spring had transformed the mountains, covering them with a green blanket of new foliage. But Raven Rock remained somber, as if the season had failed to penetrate the melancholy of the place. The men set to work, using shovels and pickaxes to carefully dig around and within the stone circle. The work was arduous, for the soil was rocky and compact. After approximately 3 hours of digging, Marcus Henley made a disturbing discovery. His shovel hit an object that was neither stone nor root. Kneeling down, he started digging with his hands, gently removing the soil. What came out of the hard earth made all the men instinctively step back. It was a human skull, small and delicate, clearly from a child or teenager, and there were more. As they kept digging in that specific spot, they uncovered more bones, not from just one person, but from several. Tesla felt a cold chill. They had uncovered something far bigger than they had anticipated. For the rest of that day, and part of the next, the men worked systematically, recording each discovery. In total, they found remains that appeared to belong to at least 5 different individuals, all buried at different depths within and around the stone circle. Some bones were very old, discolored by soil and time, while others were relatively recent. Among the bones, they also found unsettling objects, small amulets made of woven twigs similar to the necklace found on Margaret, fragments of decayed fabric, a tarnished silver medallion with an unreadable inscription, and something even stranger, a collection of small animal bones, mostly from birds, arranged in geometric patterns, as if part of some ritual. Tesla instructed that all the remains be carefully gathered and taken to the city. Dr. Pritchard was called to examine the bones. The old doctor worked for days in his basic office, using the best anatomical knowledge available at the time. His conclusion was grim. The bones belonged to 3 adult women, a teenage girl, and a child around 10 years old, likely a boy. The ages of the remains varied greatly, from very old, perhaps 50 or 60 years, to relatively recent, possibly just a few years. The news spread rapidly through the mountain communities. Raven Rock was not just the site of one mysterious death. It was apparently a secret burial ground, a place where multiple victims had been taken over many decades. Tesla now faced a much more complex investigation. He began comparing the discovered remains with missing persons reports from county and neighboring archives. Several potential matches emerged. The teenager might be a girl named Sarah Winters, who vanished in 1887 while berry picking in the mountains. One adult woman was likely Catherine Morrison, a widow who disappeared in 1892 while visiting a friend on a remote farm. The child could be little Timothy Oakes, who got lost from his parents during a mountain journey in 1879. The other victims remained unidentified, their identities lost to time. But the most shocking find came when Tesla looked into the personal items among the bones. The silver medallion, despite corrosion, still had its chain. After Dr. Pritchard carefully cleaned it with mild solvents, part of the inscription became visible. Just 2 letters, E and M. Tesla checked his files and felt a shiver. Ezekiel Moody, the itinerant preacher who disappeared in 1896, those were his initials. Records indicated Moody was known to wear a silver medallion from his mother. This meant Moody's body, originally found in a ravine 2 miles from Raven Rock, had been moved. Someone or something had first taken him to that site, perhaps for a ritual, before discarding the remains in the ravine where they were later found. But why? What was the purpose of bringing victims to Raven Rock? And crucially, who or what had been doing this for so long? Tesla compiled all the evidence and tried to build a timeline. The pattern that emerged was eerie. Roughly every few years, sometimes with longer gaps, someone would vanish in the mountains near Raven Rock. Not all were found, but those who were shared similar traits. No signs of violence, strange objects with them, and an expression of unexplainable terror. It was as if something was preying on the region, periodically selecting victims based on a logic beyond human understanding. The sheriff then made a controversial decision. He hired a folklore researcher from the University of North Carolina, a young assistant professor named Arthur Whitman, who studied Appalachian traditions. Whitman arrived in Haywood County in June, excited by the complex case. He spent weeks interviewing elders, gathering stories, legends, and oral histories. His findings were both fascinating and frightening. The tales of the walker, or the being in the high mountains, were consistent across generations and families. Details varied, but the core elements remained. A tall, shadowy figure with unnatural movements, the ability to influence minds and make people follow willingly, and victims found dead without clear cause in high, isolated places. Whitman also found intriguing information in the university's historical archives. Records from early 1700s French settlers mentioned native stories about mountain spirits taking human form and hunting lone travelers. A Jesuit missionary wrote in 1723 of reports about a demon in the highest peaks, feared more than any animal or human enemy. Armed with this, Whitman proposed a theory to Tesla. Perhaps there was something in the mountains that couldn't be explained by the science and logic of their time. Maybe the legends were rooted in something real, something that had existed there for centuries or millennia. Whitman wasn't necessarily claiming a supernatural entity. It could be a natural phenomenon related to the area's geology or atmosphere that affected the human mind strangely. Tesla listened respectfully, but remained skeptical. As a lawman, he needed concrete evidence, a real suspect to arrest and try. But as months passed with no progress, he began to accept a bitter truth. This case might never be solved. Margaret Hale and the other victims over the decades might just be more names on a dark list of unfathomable mountain mysteries. Try again. R. Continue. Edit. Part 6. The summer of 1912 brought oppressive heat to the Appalachian Mountains, along with a pervasive unrest that touched every farm, village, and lonely trail. The discovery of multiple remains at Raven Rock had turned an isolated tragedy into something much larger and more sinister. Families kept children close to home. Travelers avoided routes near the cursed area. And at night, in taverns and living rooms, people whispered about what truly lived in the dark mountain heights. Sheriff Tesla continued his investigation with a new approach. If he couldn't explain the phenomenon, he could try to prevent it. He organized regular patrols on isolated trails, especially those leading to the high peaks, put up warning signs advising travelers to stay on main paths and avoid night travel, and some communities set up escort systems requiring groups of at least 3. But the mountains were vast, resources were limited, and Tesla had only 6 deputies for hundreds of square miles. It was impossible to watch every trail and pass, and a growing sense emerged that the threat was intelligent enough to avoid patrols and patient enough to wait for the right moment. In August, Arthur Whitman found something in regional library archives that added another layer to the mystery. A diary from a trapper named Nathaniel Grayson, who lived in the mountains in the 1840s. Grayson, a solitary man, documented his daily life and disturbing encounters. In an October 1843 entry, he described seeing a tall man walking alone on a distant ridge at an altitude no normal person would be. Grayson noted the man's movement involved long, uneven strides, covering impossible distances. Watching through a rudimentary telescope, Grayson felt an inexplicable fear. He wrote that the man seemed to be searching for something, turning his head in an unnatural way. More disturbingly, Grayson mentioned finding weeks later the body of a young hunter who had vanished from the area. The body was in an odd position, hands crossed on its chest, with a necklace of twigs and feathers around its neck. Grayson was so disturbed he abandoned his traps there and never returned. He wrote a line Whitman emphasized: "There is something in the heights that does not belong to the world of men, something ancient and hungry that feeds not on flesh, but on something deeper and more precious." Whitman shared this with Tesla, and they discussed the implications. If Grayson's account from 1843 was real, it meant the pattern of disappearances and strange deaths went back at least 70 years, probably longer. If the tall man's description was consistent over decades, they were dealing with something that didn't age or die like a human, or a succession of individuals maintaining a macabre tradition or ritual. Tesla preferred the latter theory, perhaps an isolated family or cult in the remote mountains passing down sinister customs. But this explanation had flaws. Why was there no evidence of permanent habitation at the high altitudes where victims were taken? Why did patrols never find campfires, huts, or any signs of continuous human presence? In September, an event shook the investigation. One of Tesla's deputies, Robert Fisher, disappeared during a routine patrol. Fisher was experienced, born and raised in the area, and knew the trails well. He set out one clear morning with another deputy, Henry Walsh, to check trails near Raven Rock's base. They walked together, maintaining constant contact as instructed. Around noon, while resting near a stream, Fisher said he needed to step away briefly. Walsh waited, but after 5, 10, then 15 minutes, Fisher didn't return. Walsh called out, got no answer, and went to look, finding only dense trees. The forest was unnaturally silent. Walsh rushed for help. Tesla launched a large-scale search with over 50 men for 3 days. Dogs were brought in from a neighboring county. They followed Fisher's scent for about 100 yards past where Walsh last saw him. But then the trail simply ended, as if Fisher had vanished. The dogs became confused, unable to pick up any further scent. On the 4th day, a search group found something chilling. In a small clearing about 2 kilometers from where Fisher disappeared, there was a stone circle, smaller than Raven Rock's, but equally precise. In the center were footprints, boot prints, Fisher's size, and beside them larger, deeper prints from someone much bigger or heavier. The 2 sets of prints intertwined as if 2 people walked side by side, then simply ended in the circle's center, disappearing without explanation. Tesla ordered the area excavated, but they found no body, bones, or signs of burial. It was as if Fisher had walked to that circle and then ceased to exist physically. The search continued for another week, expanding to farther areas, but Robert Fisher was never found. He had vanished, swallowed by the mountains like others before him. The disappearance of one of Tesla's own deputies deeply affected the community and the investigation. If even trained, armed men in pairs weren't safe. No one was. Morale dropped. Some deputies requested transfers. Families considered moving to safer, populated areas. Tesla was desperate. He wrote to the North Carolina governor requesting state help, detailing the multiple remains and disturbing patterns over decades. The state's response was disheartening. They sent an investigator who spent 3 days in the region, interviewed people, reviewed Tesla's files, and concluded the sheriff was dealing with crimes by one or more humans, likely hermits or criminals hiding in the mountains. The investigator recommended more systematic searches and offered to send state troopers temporarily. But Tesla knew ordinary soldiers wouldn't solve this problem. Whatever the nature of the threat, it was far more intricate and elusive than a simple human criminal. He began to feel the weight of age and mounting frustration. He had dedicated months to this case, had encountered evidence that defied his understanding of reality, and yet he was further from a resolution now than at the start. Arthur Whitman, conversely, was more convinced than ever they were facing something extraordinary. He compiled all his research into a comprehensive document that included native legends, historical accounts, patterns of disappearances, and the common characteristics shared by the victims. His conclusion was that the mountains harbored a phenomenon contemporary science could not adequately explain. He proposed that perhaps unique geological or atmospheric properties in the region induced altered states of consciousness, causing people to act irrationally and place themselves in danger. Try again. R. Continue. Edit. Part 7. Autumn arrived in the mountains, painting the landscape in vibrant golds and reds, but the season's beauty could not mask the dread that had settled over Haywood County. Trees shed their leaves, exposing the slopes, and as winter neared, people prepared not just for the cold, but for the isolation the snow would bring. Many hoped that the harsh winter would force any threats lurking in the heights to retreat, entering a kind of hibernation until spring. Sheriff Tesla, now visibly aged by the pressure of recent months, made a decision many considered desperate. He summoned every willing man in the region and organized a massive expedition to the highest and most remote mountain areas. The goal was simple: find any evidence of human habitation, any cave, cabin, or structure that could serve as a hideout for whoever was behind the disappearances. Whether a cult, a deranged hermit, or a family of criminals, they needed a refuge. 63 men volunteered. They split into 7 groups, each with an experienced leader and 5 days of provisions, armed with weapons, ropes, climbing tools, and detailed maps prepared by surveyor Henry Caldwell. The expedition set out on a freezing October morning, ascending various routes toward the highest peaks. Tesla joined one group, determined to lead by example and find answers, even at the risk of his own life. The first 2 days were exhausting, but uneventful. The groups explored deep caves, some clearly never before visited, scaled dangerous cliffs, searched hidden ravines, and investigated every rock formation that might offer shelter. They found animal bones and signs of bears and other natural predators, but no evidence of permanent human presence at high elevations. On the 3rd day, a group led by Marcus Henley, the farmer who had helped excavate at Crow Rock, made a disturbing discovery. In a particularly remote area, accessible only by a difficult climb up a steep rock face, they found a wide, deep cave. The entrance was narrow and easily missed, but inside opened into a vast natural chamber. By torchlight, the men saw something that halted them. The cave walls were covered in strange markings, symbols none recognized. They weren't familiar Native American pictographs. They were different, more geometric, almost like an unknown language or notation system. And on the cave floor, arranged in circular patterns, were hundreds of bones, mostly animal, but some unmistakably human. Marcus Henley knew to document everything before disturbing the site. He left 2 men guarding the entrance and hurried down the mountain to inform Tesla. The sheriff arrived the next day with Arthur Whitman, who was eager to examine the symbols. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The cave was not just a hideout, but apparently a ritual site used repeatedly over a long period. Wittmann spent hours studying the symbols, making careful sketches. He noted that some symbols were very old, worn by moisture and time, while others were relatively recent with clear lines, suggesting the site had been used for decades, possibly centuries, by different individuals or groups. The symbols didn't match any known writing system, but repetitive patterns hinted at meaning or intention. The bones were collected and examined. Dr. Pritchard, who had climbed the mountain despite his age, identified bones from at least 3 different human individuals. Some were very old and bleached, others more recent with traces of connective tissue. Personal items were scattered throughout: rusty buttons, fragments of rotted fabric, a nearly disintegrated child's leather shoe, and curiously, several small metal objects, including a belt buckle, some ancient coins, and a wedding ring. But the most disturbing aspect was what wasn't there. No evidence of permanent habitation. No fire remains, cooking utensils, bedding, or any items typical of a dwelling. The cave was used for something, but not as a home. It was a place for visits, where rituals were performed and then abandoned until next time. Tesla ordered lookouts posted discreetly near the cave, hidden among rocks and trees, to observe and report any activity. If anyone returned, they would finally have a suspect. The lookouts took 12-hour shifts, enduring the growing autumn chill and the eerie solitude of the high altitudes. Days turned into weeks, but no one appeared. The cave remained empty and silent, guarding its secrets. Meanwhile, Arthur Wittmann continued his research with renewed focus. He traveled to libraries in other parts of North Carolina and even Virginia, searching for historical references to symbols like those in the cave. In a Richmond University library, he found an intriguing, if disturbing, clue: records of a heretical European sect from the 1700s that believed in intermediary entities called world walkers between the physical and spiritual worlds. Historical texts said this sect practiced rituals involving human sacrifices to these entities in exchange for knowledge or power. The sect was eventually persecuted and destroyed by the church in Europe, but there was speculation some members fled to the New World, settling in remote areas to continue their practices away from authorities. The symbols described in the sect's historical records bore a striking resemblance to those in the cave, not identical, but sharing enough structural features to suggest a possible connection. Wittmann felt both excitement and horror. If his theory was correct, the mountain disappearances were not the work of a single individual or a criminal family, but potentially the continuation of a centuries-old occult tradition passed down through generations. He shared his findings with Tesla, who received the information with mixed interest and skepticism. Even if a cult was operating, it still didn't explain the case's more bizarre aspects: the impossible distances victims traveled, the lack of struggle signs, the expressions of transcendent terror on their faces, the unnatural movements of the tall man, described by multiple witnesses over decades. Some elements transcended even the explanation of a deranged religious cult. In November, with the first snow already covering the highest peaks, an event added another layer of mystery. One of the lookouts near the cave, an experienced hunter named Daniel Crawford, came down the mountain in a state of profound shock. He was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide, and it took hours for him to speak coherently. When he did, his story was terrifying. During his midnight shift, he heard something abnormal. Not wind or animals, but a distorted, echoing voice, seeming to come from all directions. Huddled behind rocks with his rifle, he saw a tall figure moving in the darkness toward the cave, its limbs bent at odd angles, its strides covering impossible distances. Daniel wanted to shoot or scream, but found himself completely paralyzed, not by ordinary fear, but something deeper, as if his will was disconnected from his body. He watched as the figure approached the cave. In the dim moonlight, he felt it turn its face toward him, though he could discern no features, only the sensation of being watched by something not quite human. Then the figure entered the cave and disappeared. Try again. R. Continue. Edit Part 8. Daniel Crawford's recovery of his motor skills took several minutes that felt like an eternity. When he finally moved, he stumbled down the mountain in the dark, scratching himself on branches and rocks, driven by sheer terror that overrode any duty to stay at his post. He didn't stop until he reached the first inhabited cabin, almost 3 miles away, where he banged on the door so hard he woke the entire family. There, he began screaming, recounting what he had seen between sobs and uncontrollable tremors. Sheriff Tesla gathered 15 armed men the next morning and climbed to the cave. They approached with extreme caution, weapons ready. The cave entrance was exactly as they had left it, with no fresh footprints in the thin overnight snow and no signs of passage. Tesla lit a torch and entered the main chamber, followed by the others. At first, everything seemed unchanged, the symbols on the walls, the bone arrangements on the floor. But then Marcus Henley noticed something different. In the center of the cave, where there had been an empty space, was a new, smaller circle of stones, and inside it was an object that made all the men recoil. The deputy badge of Robert Fisher, the man who had disappeared in September. The metal was polished, clean, almost gleaming in the torchlight, as if carefully prepared and placed there like an offering or trophy. The discovery confirmed Fisher was dead, though his body was still missing, and that someone or something had visited the cave during the night, just as Daniel Crawford reported. But how had this entity entered and left without leaving footprints? How had it evaded the other lookouts? These questions remained unanswered, defying all logic. Tesla made a difficult decision. He ordered the cave entrance sealed with stones and mortar. If this place was used for sinister rituals, he would deny access to anyone returning. It was a desperate measure, but he felt he had to do something to break the cycle of death plaguing the mountains for so long. 12 men worked for 2 days to completely seal the entrance, carrying heavy stones and mortar up the mountain in buckets. When finished, the entrance was blocked by a stone wall blending into the natural rock face. Tesla hoped this would be enough to stop the disappearances, but deep down, he knew it was likely temporary. If something had been operating there for decades or centuries, a stone wall would hardly be a permanent obstacle. Winter arrived with full force in December 1912. Heavy snow blanketed the mountains, making upper trails impassable. Communities retreated to their homes, burning wood in fireplaces and waiting out the cold months. During the winter, there were no new disappearances. People began to breathe a sigh of relief, murmuring that the worst was over, that sealing the cave had worked. Arthur Whitman spent those winter months writing a comprehensive account of everything he had discovered. He meticulously documented the legends, historical accounts, disappearance patterns, and all physical evidence. His work would eventually be published in an obscure academic journal, largely ignored by the scientific community of the time, and dismissed as fanciful folklore mixed with poorly investigated criminal cases. But Whitman knew there was something genuine in it all, something that the science of 1912 lacked the tools to understand or explain. Spring of 1913 arrived sooner than expected. Snow began melting in March, revealing the mountain slopes and reopening the trails. With the thaw came renewed hope. Perhaps the nightmare was finally over. Families resumed normal routines, and travelers used the mountain trails again, though they still carefully avoided areas near Raven Rock and other sinister locations. Tesla organized a verification expedition as soon as weather permitted to check if the cave seal remained intact. A group of 8 men climbed to the site on a clear April morning. What they found left them stunned and dismayed. The stone wall they had carefully built was completely destroyed, not collapsed by snow or erosion, but deliberately dismantled. Stones were scattered around the entrance as if ripped out by brute force and thrown aside. The mortar was broken into pieces, some showing marks like scratches from fingers digging through the hardened material. Tesla entered the cave with a heavy heart. Everything inside was unchanged, except for one disturbing addition. In the center of the main chamber was an elaborate arrangement of bones forming a complex circular pattern, and in the very center of this pattern sat an object that made Tesla's blood run cold, a framed photograph taken from the Hale family home. The photograph showed Margaret Hale smiling gently, a picture taken about a year before her death. How had it gotten there? Who had taken it from her family's home and brought it to this cursed place? This violation, this insult to Margaret's memory and her family's pain, ignited a rage in Tesla unlike anything he had ever felt. He rushed from the cave, shouting into the empty mountains, daring whoever or whatever was responsible to show themselves and face him directly instead of hiding in the shadows. His voice echoed through the valleys, but the only reply was the indifferent silence of nature. The men with him grew concerned. Tesla was clearly at his breaking point, worn down by months of frustration. Marcus Henley gently persuaded him to descend, arguing that shouting wouldn't bring answers. Tesla reluctantly agreed, but everyone could see something in him had shattered. The realization that he was fighting something beyond his comprehension, let alone his ability to defeat, had finally broken through his rational defenses. In the following weeks, Tesla became a shadow of his former self. He performed his duties as sheriff, but the energy and determination were gone. He slept and ate little. His wife begged him to let the case go, to accept that some mysteries are unsolvable. But Tesla couldn't. Margaret Hale, Robert Fisher, Catherine Morrison, Sarah Winters, Ezekiel Moody. All these victims and their families deserved justice, and answers he had failed to provide. In May, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the sheriff's office with no return address, the envelope stained and worn. Inside was a single sheet with a message in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. The mountains remember. The mountains guard. The mountains claim what belongs to them. Stop searching for what you can never find. Embrace the mystery or become part of it. Tesla showed the letter to Arthur Whitman, who noted the unusual ink and antique paper. The handwriting suggested a formal education from a previous century. But who had sent it? Was it a veiled threat, a warning that Tesla himself might disappear if he continued? Try again. R. Continue. Edit Part 9. The mysterious letter became a turning point, but not as a deterrent. It reignited a fierce determination in Tesla. If the perpetrator was sending warnings, it meant Tesla was getting close. He launched a new investigation, focusing on the region's oldest families, searching for a lineage connected to the events. He spent weeks studying property records, birth and death certificates, and family trees. Patterns emerged, pointing to one family in particular, the Corvines. They owned secluded land on the upper slopes near Raven Rock since at least 1750. What was peculiar was their near absence from official records. They rarely appeared in town, lived in isolation, and their property passed to a single heir each generation without being sold or divided. Tesla decided to visit the Corvine estate. He took Marcus Henley and 2 other trusted men. The journey took most of a day on narrow, poorly maintained trails. As they climbed higher, the atmosphere changed. The light turned eerie, and forest sounds faded into an unsettling silence. Finally, they reached a clearing with a dark, moss-covered log cabin, its small windows like empty eyes. There were no cultivated fields or livestock. Tesla knocked, identified himself, but got no answer. Finding the door unlocked, he pushed it open. The interior was dark and cold, sparsely furnished, but the walls were covered with thousands of carved symbols, the same kind found in the cave, but on a massive scale. On a table were books and notebooks, filled with the same elegant handwriting from the letter. The writing was primarily English, but included unrecognizable words and phrases, mixing personal notes, philosophical observations, and ritual instructions. One passage sent a chill down Tesla's spine. It spoke of overlapping layers of reality, entities existing in between, and how they needed human anchors to manifest in the physical world, offering knowledge, longevity, and power in return. Marcus Henley called out from the back, having found a hidden door behind a bookshelf leading to a cellar. Tesla descended into a large, stone-reinforced underground space that served as a macabre museum of the victim's belongings. Clothes were neatly folded and labeled. Personal items like watches, rings, and photographs were arranged on shelves. Tesla recognized objects from his cases: Ezekiel Moody's Bible, a doll belonging to Sarah Winters, and more of Margaret Hale's belongings, including the shawl she wore when she disappeared. Most disturbing were oil portraits on one wall, showing the same man at different ages, dated from 1762 to 1911, the same face, gradually aging over 150 years. Tesla understood the horrific truth. The Corvines were a single individual, living for generations through some terrible pact, using the victim's life forces to sustain his unnatural existence by serving entities from beyond. Tesla gathered evidence notebooks, photographs, victims' belongings, and ordered his men to do the same. As they prepared to leave, they heard slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the open door. "Try again, R. Do the final part and ask to register edit part 10. The four men froze inside the cabin, hearts pounding as the footsteps neared. Tesla gripped his revolver, positioning himself by the door, while the others stood ready in the corners. The footsteps stopped at the doorway, and a tense silence fell. Then, a shadow fell across the opening, and a man entered, ordinary-looking, in his 60s, with graying hair and simple clothes. He showed no surprise, his expression suggesting he had expected this visit. His eyes, however, held an ancient depth that clashed with his appearance. The man sighed, as if relieved a long journey was over. Tesla, gun still aimed, demanded his name. In a soft, polite voice with an unplaceable accent, the man introduced himself as Silas Corvine, admitting it was just his latest identity. He spoke calmly, seemingly relieved to share his story. What he revealed over the next hours was so disturbing, Tesla would never include it fully in his reports. Silas explained he came to the mountains in the mid-1700s, fleeing religious persecution in Europe. He belonged to an ancient order, studying the boundaries between planes of existence. The Appalachian Mountains, particularly spots like Raven Rock, were places where reality was thin and permeable. He made contact with entities from the in-between spaces, beings barely comprehensible to the human mind. In exchange for serving as their bridge to the physical world, he received the knowledge to extend his life far beyond natural limits. But there was a price. The entities required life energy from living humans to sustain their manifestations. For over 150 years, Silas had upheld this terrible pact. He claimed he didn't choose victims arbitrarily, but waited for those who were alone, vulnerable, or emotionally fragile times, when the human mind was most susceptible to influence, allowing him to lead them willingly to designated sites. The entities would then drain their life force, leaving no physical marks, only that look of transcendent terror. But now, Silas confessed wearily, he was exhausted. More than a century and a half of existence had taken its toll. A shred of his remaining humanity was rebelling. Margaret Hale, he said brokenly, would be his last victim. He could go on no longer. Tesla listened with horror, disbelief, and a flicker of pity. But it vanished as he thought of Margaret, Robert Fisher, and all the other victims. He knew he could never prove this in court, but he had the physical evidence from the basement. He arrested Silas Corvine that afternoon, handcuffing him for the descent. As they walked, Silas warned that breaking the pact would have consequences. The entities would not accept the loss of their facilitator and might find another way to manifest, causing worse damage. "The mountains remember," he repeated. "The mountains guard, and the mountains will always reclaim what is theirs." Tesla ignored this as a final intimidation attempt. They reached town at dusk, and Silas was jailed. Tesla spent the night preparing charges, documenting the evidence. But the next morning, the cell was empty. Silas had vanished. The bars were intact, the door locked, the windows too small. The guard swore he saw nothing. A search was futile. Silas was gone, taken or departed by means beyond understanding. The evidence remained, stored in the county archives, but without the accused, the case stalled. In the following months, there were no new disappearances. Raven Rock stayed quiet. People slowly returned to normal, though with caution on isolated trails. Tesla never spoke publicly of Silas's full confession. His official report simply stated a suspect linked to the disappearances had escaped. Arthur Whitman, however, recorded every detail in his journals and later published a book on Appalachian folklore with sanitized versions of the Margaret Hale case and Raven Rock mysteries, which was largely ignored at the time, but rediscovered decades later. Tesla ordered the Corvine cabin burned to the ground, erasing all traces. The fire burned through the night, a giant pyre visible for miles. He retired in 1915, unable to continue after confronting realities he wished he'd never known, and died in 1928, taking many secrets to his grave. Margaret Hale rests in the small Baptist churchyard, her headstone a marker for a hoped-for peace. Her story, and those of the other mountain victims, have become part of Appalachian dark lore, told as warnings on dark nights. The mountains remain, majestic and indifferent. Raven Rock stands as a silent monument to unsolved mysteries. Even today, reports occasionally surface of lone travelers vanishing without a trace, leaving behind grief and unanswered questions. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Some truths, once revealed, cannot be forgotten. And some mountains hold secrets older, deeper, and darker than any record can capture. If this story has disturbed you, piqued your curiosity about the mysteries lurking at reality's edges, then join us on this journey through history's most disturbing cases. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future investigations. Leave a comment with your thoughts and where you're watching from. And if you know someone who enjoys true mysteries that challenge our assumptions about the world, share this video. Sometimes, the most terrifying stories are those with a kernel of truth that is impossible to ignore.